Good afternoon, everyone. Craig Kiger, Minnesota DNR Outreach, and today's episode 196 of the Moss series. And this event will be recorded. The multimedia viewers down in the lower right-hand corner, if you need that service, feel free to click on that. We're going to save the chat function for posting links, and we have quite a few links for you today. The Q&A section is going to be open and available for you to type in your questions, and we will ask them to our expert. So I want to welcome everybody. And Brian, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about yourself and where you're from?
Right on. Well, I appreciate the invite to speak to you all today. My name is Brian Schwingle, and I'm the coordinator of the DNR's Forest Health Program. Our little team does a lot of stuff, but basically we're charged with knowing what's happening knowing all the problems that are happening with our forests, tracking them, investigating them. We do a lot of on the ground field investigations for mainly professional land managers. So today I'm very happy to talk with you about oak wilt. So should I take it away, Craig?
Yep, go ahead and just jump right into your presentation.
Alrighty. Well, buckle in, everyone. There's a lot to cover here, and I'm just mainly covering identification and prevention today. But first, I want to talk about oaks, oak trees and oak forests. They are awesome. And there are two main groups of oaks in the upper Midwest. There are white oaks and there are red oaks. And it's really important to understand the difference between these two groups when we're talking about oak wilt. The main way to tell the difference is pretty easy. As you can see on the picture on the left, the white oak group, their leaves have rounded lobes. They aren't sharp and pointy like those for red oaks, like you can see on the right. And if this were if we were all in person right now, I would ask, how many oak species do we have in the state? And the answer is 7. For white oaks, we have swamp white oak, bur oak, and chinkapin oak, which only gets up into the southeastern part of our southeasternmost county, Houston County. For red oaks, we have northern red oak, northern pin oak, and black oak. And so probably for the rest of this talk, most of this talk, I'm just going to be referring to either white oaks or red oaks. Now, oaks are awesome. Why are they awesome? Well, they are our big trees. So if you were to guess, again, I wish I could quiz you, but if you were to guess what are the most numerous trees in the state of Minnesota that have trunks that are 17 inches or larger across, so in diameter, cross section, the answer is the most numerous big tree, 17 inches or bigger in Minnesota, is bur oak, followed by northern red oak, followed by quaking aspen. And here is an estimate of the numbers. So the United States Forest Service, the federal government, they have a program called Forest Inventory and Analysis that is kind of like the Census Bureau for humans. And they count trees and they track their fluctuations over time and how many are dead, how many are harvested, questions who owns them, questions like that. So here are the numbers in Minnesota for trees larger than 17 inches. And in terms of like the types of forests, if we were to define forests, if we were to label them based off of the dominant tree in the forest, aspen rules in Minnesota. You can see almost 30% of Minnesota's forests are dominated by quaking aspen, but the second most common forest type are those that are dominated by oaks. You can see 9.2% of Minnesota's forests are oaks, slightly ahead of black spruce. So they're really common. Oak in Minnesota and throughout North America, it's a ecologically foundational species. They have the highest biomass out of all the tree genera, and they're the most diverse. So when I say genera, that refers to the first part of the scientific name. All species have have a scientific name, and the and those we refer to them as two words, and they're Latin. Basically, the genus refers to what everyone calls a tree type. So oaks, maples, spruces, pines, those are all genera. And so here's a graph, and the tallest bar there represents oaks. And what that graph is showing is that almost 20% of the biomass of trees in the United States are made up of oaks. That's more than pines. Across the continental United States, that's more than pines, that's more than maples, that's more than firs. And then there's that funky genus name called Pseudotsuga, which most people will know that as Doug fir. So there's a lot of our forests made up of oak trees, biomass. In terms of diversity, it's also the most diverse genus or tree type in the United States and in Mexico. 91 There are 91 species of oaks in the United States and Canada. Even more in Mexico, way more in Mexico actually. And because they are such a common species and they've been around for eons, they're extremely important for maintaining biodiversity. If we were to lose our biodiversity of oaks on the continent, our fauna, wildlife species, and like microbes would also decrease. Um, onto wildlife species, there are a lot of wildlife species that rely on cavities in trees. Um, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe there are like about 43 bird species in Minnesota that rely on cavities for habitat, and about 25 mammal species. Now, that's not specific to oak, but the deal with oak is they're really common and they're generally a long-lived tree that has really durable wood, meaning that, for example, and they're big. And some species rely on a minimum size for a den. So they're really important whether they're living, whether they're dead, standing, whether they're down or dead. Um, and of course, I'm sure all of you know this, that they make acorns. And acorns are a type of wildlife food called hard mast. So like a shelled, um, kind of not very perishable food source that's really high in protein, fats, and carbohydrates. And again, because they are so dominant, oaks produce more hard mast than any other tree in eastern North America, in Minnesota. And, and because of that, a lot of like acorns make up a large percentage of certain game and non-game species habitat. And it improves their health, improves wildlife health if they're able to eat a lot of acorns. Super important. Not and This is also really interesting. Oaks don't always produce the same amount of acorns every year. Some years they produce a ton of acorns, so much so that I have literally almost fallen, rolled onto my back in the woods because there are so many acorns covering the forest floor. And then the following year, frequently after you have a huge crop of acorns, you have very little. That up and down nature of acorn production greatly affects the sizes and the health of wildlife populations too. So oaks are critical. Oaks are huge. On to what I'm supposed to talk about today, oak wilt basics. Okay, so oak wilt is a disease. All diseases are caused by pathogens. So of course, you can think of COVID-19. COVID-19 was caused by a virus. Oak wilt is a tree disease and it's caused by a fungal pathogen. And that fungal pathogen this is the scientific name, it doesn't have an English name. It's called Brachyella fagacearum. I will refer to that as either the oak wilt pathogen or the oak wilt fungus. It's the cause of the disease oak wilt. It's not considered native. Almost all signs indicate that it's not native. Um, it's like nationwide. If we were to take a look at all the genes of the oak wilt pathogen, it's the diversity in its genetic makeup matches that of other non-natives. There's no known resistance in mature red oaks. We've never found a mature red oak that's resistant to oak wilt on this continent, highly indicative of it being non-native, and it's spreading. it's spreading outward into our forests. Also very indicative of it being an invasive. So the disease oak wilt, the type of disease it is, it's a vascular wilt. So when I say vascular, I'm talking about tubes that carry liquid. So like with human health, when we talk about the vasculature, we're talking about veins and arteries. So when we're talking about vasculature in trees, we're talking about, if you've heard of the xylem and the phloem, you can think of those as the water tubes. So all wood is a bunch of vertical tubes that carries water. So oak attacks those tubes that carry the water, and you can just think of that as like the sapwood or the wood. You can see here that the tree oaks, they try to fight off the pathogen that's inside those water conducting tubes, and it sometimes the tree will actually like poison its own cells and kill them, and you can see, and sometimes it'll produce other chemicals that discolor the wood, and sometimes you with if a tree is infected with oak wilt, you can see these patterns of discoloration in the sapwood, like you can see on that picture on the right. Now, other problems will also cause discoloration in wood. And just because you don't see discoloration doesn't mean that oak wilt is not there. So here's a map showing basically the density of the red oak group, the red oak trees in Minnesota. So the more like black dots you see, kind of the heavier the concentration of forests that are dominated by red oaks. Those forests are particularly susceptible to damage from oak wilt. So you can see there's a lot of red oak dominated forests in the state. Now, I'm going to show you where we have confirmed oak wilt in the state. These are all these lighter blue dots. Now, oak wilt was first confirmed in Minnesota in the 40s. It was probably here earlier, maybe decades earlier. But these dots show the extent of known oak wilt. Now, just like in all invasive species, oak wilt is very difficult to detect, very difficult to detect. And certainly there's more oak wilt out there than we are aware of, without a doubt. In our experience in like northern Wisconsin, where I used to work for the Wisconsin DNR, and then I worked for Minnesota DNR for a long time too, whenever we find oak wilt at a new spot that's kind of far away from other spots, the average distance away from known oak wilt is about 20 miles. And so we recommend that if you're within 20 miles of oak wilt, you really should consider the fact that oak wilt threatens your forests. And if we were to add up all of that area, which is shown here in the orange on this map, that's almost 50% of the range of red oak. Now, the thing is, something that's very unique about oak wilt as an invasive species is that it's been here since the 1940s, yet it still has only covered about 50% of the range of red oak. I'm not sure of any other invasive species that has affected our forests that has moved so slowly. For example, Dutch elm disease, which you may have heard of, that's another vascular wilt that affects our elms. That was first confirmed in Minnesota sometime in the 70s, I believe. And of course, it spread throughout the state in about 2 decades. There's another disease called butternut canker that has made our butternut trees a threatened and endangered species. That equally covered the whole range of butternut in about that same time, 2 decades, something like that. So oak wilt is pretty unique, which actually gives us a lot of hope that we can, through all of our collective actions, actually slow its spread. And I'll talk about that later. But first of all, I'm going to talk about how to identify oak wilt. I will say I've been doing this. I've been doing forest health work in the eastern part of the country for about 21 years. And in that time frame, I can tell you oak wilt is about the most complicated disease to confirm. And like a lot of people who are aging, the older I get, the lower my confidence is in confirming oak wilt, especially on white oaks. But I'll give you some pointers here. If you have an oak and it's rapidly dropping its leaves in the summertime, and it's starting to lose its leaves first at the outer edge of the canopy, that is likely to be oak wilt. And if I zoom in on these pictures here, you can see all of these leaves on the ground and in the middle of the summer. That that's a major red flag for you to consider the fact that you might have oak wilt. Here's another picture near Little Falls, Minnesota in Morrison County. See all those leaves on the driveway? This is actually in the South Metro in one of our beautiful regional parks here in the Metro. In the middle of summer, see all the oak leaves on the grass and the trail? Almost certainly oak wilt. Now, lightning strike can do that, but if a tree is lightning struck, you're gonna see high, like the at in the best case scenario, um, bark blown off a whole one side of the tree. Okay, so here's a little bit more in depth of about how to identify oak wilt, or how the symptoms progress from infection to death. So the initial symptoms are that the leaves turn kind of off green at the edge of the canopy, like is shown here. Um, after Shortly after you get the leaves slightly turning off green, you'll get rapid leaf drop on white oaks or red oaks. And the leaves that fall on the ground are going to be a combination of some leaves will be totally green, and a lot of the leaves will have kind of a bronzed margin or edge to the leaf, with kind of the middle portion remaining green, and then some of the leaves that fall on the ground will be totally brown or tan almost. On red oaks, you get death occurs very rapidly. Once symptoms start, you can get death in 1 month on a red oak. Here's a shot of a probably a northern red oak, um, that's showing, near death in about 2 months, from June through the end of August. And you get rapid leaf drop, abundant leaf drop too. Now here's a shot of a huge bur oak outside, in Lake City, and you can see that bur oaks take a lot longer to die, and that's true in general for white oaks. So I've seen bur oaks die in about 1 month, just like with red oaks. But then I've seen bur oaks kind of hang on, and they kind of get this dieback in the canopy. Another symptom on red oaks are bark cracks, and those bark cracks form over what's called a spore mat. So the actual fungus, you can see on the picture on the far right shows that kind of elliptical gray mass. That's the actual oak wilt fungus itself, Bretziella. And that's like a fungal mass or a pad. And it actually grows enough so that it will crack open the bark. And so that happens on about 40% of infected red oaks, and it happens a few months after symptoms start. And here's another shot. Now, one of our oak species is called a northern pin oak. Young northern pin oaks have pretty thin bark, and those pressure pads that are in the middle of the fungal mats or the spore mats, they can actually force their way. They can pop the bark open like this and stick out. So that's a shot there of a northern pin oak in Pine County. Oh, and by the way, those the spore mats, they smell sweet. I think they smell like bananas. Some people think they smell like juicy fruit gum. If you're from the 80s, you'll know how that smells. Um, the final symptom I'll show is that over time, in a forest that's dominated by one species of oak, you'll get a disease center forming because the disease actually spreads from tree to tree through the roots. I'll cover that a little bit more, but you get this outward, almost circular pattern of progressive mortality or death in a forest. A pocket will develop. But again, back to kind of oak wilt 101 and the easiest way to identify oak wilt. If you are getting abundant leaves on the ground, abundant, and in 1 month, a red oak has dropped like 90% or more of its leaves, or 2 months, that's probably oak wilt in Minnesota. Again, lightning strike can do that. There's also a disease called bacterial leaf scorch, which has never been confirmed in Minnesota or Wisconsin. I suspect it's here in very low numbers. That can do that too, but then the next year the tree comes back, which is not the case with oak wilt. Now, there are some lookalikes to oak wilt that really confuse people. There's a disease, it's a native leaf disease that's called bur oak blight. It only affects our bur oaks. It's shown on the left. This, it can cause rapid leaf drop, but the thing is, bur oak blight, the symptoms start on the inner lower canopy, whereas with oak wilt, the symptoms will start at the canopy edge. And the next year after bur oak blight, the tree will look fine. It's just kind of an annual disease of the leaves. Whereas with oak wilt, it's a disease of those wood conduct those water moving vessels, the vasculature, and it doesn't go away. It always stays there. So on the white oak group, big white oak, frequently you're going to get buyback. And the following year, the portion of the crown that showed the leaf symptoms and dropped all those leaves, it's not going to come back, like the picture shown on the right. Um, our most Probably our most common pest, the oaks, is called two-lined chestnut borer. Now, even though it's called a chestnut borer, American chestnut was never native to Minnesota. Um, and it will infect American chestnuts out east and here if they're planted. But it's the main insect enemy of oaks. It's native. It generally doesn't kill oaks in 1 year. So if a tree is infected like this one on the left, that's a red oak with two-line chestnut borer, it'll typically take 3 years for the two-line chestnut borer to kill the whole tree. Some trees can recover from two-line chestnut borer too, but very frequently a symptom, if you're looking at the tree, will be this dead red green appearance to the canopy. And so it won't die in 1 year. It'll take a few years to die generally. Whereas with oak wilt on a red oak, you have symptom develop that progresses across the entire canopy in a couple months at most. Here's another shot of two-line. In recent years, we've had some really severe droughts, which have weakened some oaks, which has allowed two-line chestnut borer to actually kill them in 1 year. But with two-line chestnut borer, the leaves die in the canopy and they'll stay up there for months. They'll actually stay, a lot of leaves will stay on over the winter time. That won't happen to that degree on oak wilt, like shown on the right. But again, like I kind of said at the beginning of this section, um, it can be really confusing when you take a look at the landscape. Here are images of oaks. They all look like oak wilt. None of them are oak wilt. They've all been um, they've all confused professionals, even yours truly and or other professionals. None of these are oak wilt. So what do you do if you think you have oak wilt? Well, if you have a yard oak tree, or if you own woods and you have a forester out there, and get a second opinion. Second opinions are always good. Even if I tell you that you have oak wilt, go ahead, get a second opinion. Um, and you can submit a sample. That's crucial, especially if it's on white oaks. I You basically need a lab confirmation to confirm oak wilt on our white oak group. The picture on the right shows a bur oak in Pine County. It has retained a lot of leaves, as you can see. There was quite a bit of leaf drop, but we lab confirmed that as oak wilt on a bur oak. It had a big wound where the oak wilt got into it. But the University of Minnesota has a disease clinic, a plant disease clinic. You can submit samples. Here's their website. I think the website's going to be put in the chat too. And for a fee, they can confirm whether you have oak wilt or not definitively. And I highly recommend using those, especially if you're going to invest 1 cent in oak wilt control. Get a lab confirmation. It's worth the small price. So I'm going to cover a little bit about how oak wilt spreads, because it's important to know how oak wilt spreads to know how we can prevent oak wilt. So oak wilt spreads in 2 ways. It spreads above ground and it spreads below ground through the roots. Above ground infection, it's quite a bit more complicated than how the disease spreads through the root system. And so above ground infection starts with a red oak, typically dying from oak wilt. And either, if it dies in the spring or summer, it might produce spores in the fall. If it dies in the summer, it's probably going to produce spores in the following spring. And again, we talked about bark cracks. Under the bark cracks is this spore mat. those spores, they don't move with rain or wind like other diseases, like some other diseases, but they move with because insects are attracted to the sweet smell, and those insects, sap beetles, that sap beetle right there is only up to 5 millimeters long. There are only about two sap beetle species in Minnesota that carry about 90% or more of the oak wilt. We have a lot of sap beetle species, but only a couple species carry it. Now, look at the picture in the lower left. That's firewood. If firewood is comes from a diseased oak that was diseased within the last few months and killed, that oak wilt, that firewood can easily produce spore mats too. So don't move firewood if it's from an oak that died within a year. Now these sap beetles, they inadvertently pick up those oak wilt fungal spores. They're also attracted to wounds, fresh wounds. So you can see there's a wound here on this oak on the right. They're attracted to that and they inadvertently drop off those spores. The spores germinate and grow in the wood tissue, in the sapwood. And that's how above ground infection starts. Now, there are about seven different points that have to, seven different things that have to happen at a certain time of year for above ground infection to happen. The stars have to align, kind of. And basically, it only happens from roughly mid-April through mid-July. That's when above ground infection can happen in Minnesota. There's never been any confirmed natural above ground infection that has occurred after mid-July in the upper Midwest. Now, the disease will move through the roots too. So once a tree is infected, the fungus produces spores and it can actually grow these threads in the sapwood tissue, and the spores will move up and down quickly in the sap stream, very quickly. And they can go down into the roots, they get sucked into the roots. And the picture on the right shows connected roots that actually fuse together from different oak species, and the fungus can get sucked right in through those root graft into the neighboring oaks. So this picture on the left is up in Pine County, and it shows that kind of like little shrubby oak in the middle, that short thing that's turning brown. That's a bunch of stems growing out of a stump. And then you can see the larger oak with the dead top that's leaning over. The dead top was not killed by oak wilt, but the leaves are starting to turn green at the edge of the canopy. I have very little doubt that the tree that was cut down in the middle, it was a big tree that was cut down. It had oak wilt, and the oak wilt was in the root system, and all those little sprouts shot up from the stump and formed like that oak bush. So they got it from its own root system, and then the oak wilt moved to the next oak, the neighboring oak, through root grafts and infected that too. So that shows below ground spread. Some fun facts here about below ground spread. The maximum distance oak wilt has moved in 1 year from one oak to the next oak in the upper Midwest is 41 feet. That's the maximum distance. On average, it can move about roughly like 12 feet per year on average from one oak to the next oak. Another fun fact is that the oak wilt fungus can survive in the root system for 5 years without the top of the tree. So if you have a tree that died of oak wilt, and you cut it down, do so in the wintertime. If you're not going to control it, just cut the tree in the wintertime. The oak fungus is going to survive in that root system underground for up to 5 years. So here's a kind of a little cartoon with how this all works. So let's pretend like that tree on the left is an oak and it died. And then the oak wilt fungus, it goes into the root system, and so it moves to the next oak through that root system. That can occur from, the next year or the next year up to 5 years after that fact. So then now you got these two trees on the left that died of oak wilt. The one in the middle there got it from underground spread from the one on the left. Now the one in the middle there, second from the left, it's a red oak, and it produces a spore mat. What's attracted to the spore mat? A sap beetle. That sap beetle then is also attracted to a wound. Let's pretend that the tree on the right was pruned in May. That sap beetle is going to be attracted to that fresh wound. It's going to inadvertently deposit the oak wilt fungus's spores on that wound. And within 1 month, you're going to get symptoms developing on that red oak. And then in the next 2 months, you're going to get total tree death. So that's how oak wilt works. All right. So what do you do if you have oak wilt? Well, if you have property or if you see oak wilt outside of that darker shaded zone, we want you to report it. Why? Because oak wilt is an invasive species that's slowly spreading out into northern Minnesota forests, and we want to help landowners, including private woodland owners, private homeowners, and public forest landowners. We want to help everyone. We want to guide them on how best to control oak wilt. So we need those reports. We need to know where oak wilt is at outside that, beyond the core infested zone. How to report it? There are many ways to report it, but we would prefer that it's reported through one of these two apps. I actually think there are I would just stick with these two apps, the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, GLEDN app, or the EDD Maps app. They function the same. You can also go to the EDD Maps website to report. Now, if you live on the outer fringes of the hashed area, let's say you live in kind of like um, you know, northwestern Crow Wing County, for example, or if you live anywhere in Carleton County, we want to know about oak wilt, or if you live beyond, we want to know about oak wilt. Contact your DNR, your local DNR forestry office, and there's a link that I think Cassie can pop into the chat to find out where your local DNR forestry office is. We want to know. Those reports will go to the local DNR forestry office, and then they'll go to us. If you're in the basically if you live in the white zone, okay. Now with those apps or with the website, we need pictures to be taken, and we need probably 3 pictures to be taken, and they need to be taken in July or August. If we get a picture of a dead oak, that doesn't tell us anything. Um, we need to see active symptoms of oak wilt, so those typically happen in July and August. So we need a whole canopy shot. We need an image showing a ton of leaves on the ground, and we need a close-up picture of the leaves. Again, that bronze margin is very common on on trees that have oak wilt. You could also take a picture of the spore mat. Um, Relatively speaking, those are kind of rare to see. You kind of got to know what to look for, but maybe you'll see a pressure pad sticking out of the bark, like that one picture I showed. So those are the pictures we need to confirm oak wilt or a lab confirmation. All right, let's talk about preventing oak wilt. So if you have a forest or an ornamental oak in that orange area, if that tree is wounded in May or June, it has a pretty darn good chance of being infected with oak wilt. Here are a couple shots of trees with oak wilt. One in bur oak on the left there. That's a northern pin oak on the right. The northern pin oak was in Wabasha County in southeastern Minnesota. And if I zoom in here on these pictures, that bur oak on the left, a big machine drove by that bur oak in May, and it removed some bark, and that's how that tree got infected. The tree on the right, that's a blurry close up, but that tree was pruned in May. That's how that tree got oak wilt. Here are a couple other examples. Red oak on the left, red oak on the right. The one on the left is way up in Carleton County. We confirmed oak wilt for the first time in Carleton County last year. Fortunately, it was on state forest land, and we were able to control it. But if we zoom in on that picture on the left, the reason that those oaks were infected is because you had roadside brushing, so clearing brush along the roads in spring that bent over a bunch of oak saplings that you can see, and I'm sure that's how oak wilt was infected. How that got started there on the picture on the right, a tall piece of equipment was going down a woods trail and just broke a branch subtly. You can see that subtle crack, and that's how oak wilt got started on that tree. So again, um, oak wilt. Now, I'm going to talk about how to prevent oak wilt in a little bit, but oak wilt's really expensive to control. It's complicated to control. A lot of people don't have enough money to control oak wilt. But prevention it can be prevented to a large degree. And here are just pictures of uh, oak wilt control operations. So you can see lots of times heavy equipment is required. Lots of times burning or destroying a lot of oak brush is required. Um, Frequently, almost always in a forest, you have to sacrifice. You have to preemptively kill a lot of healthy looking red oaks around the disease oaks to get a hold of the disease. So you end up getting these big pockets in your woods. Um, you have to preemptively kill trees. Um, and here just shows kind of the complexity of how to control oak wilt. It's complex. I'm not going to get into it. Um, Oak wilt also it's ecologically harmful in many cases. So prevention is super important. This picture on the left shows it's an oak wilt pocket. The bigger trees are dead oaks killed by oak wilt. Um, and I think a lot of people would look at this forest on the left and be like, well, I don't like how those dead oaks look, but at least there are baby trees growing in the understory. The thing is, none of those young trees, none of those seedlings or saplings are oaks. They're common buckthorn and they're red maple. Um, the future if left untouched, if no one would touch that patch of oak wilt right there, the future of that zone is basically a prickly, brushy zone that nobody's going to want to walk through. Actually, a lot of large game species wouldn't want to walk through there either. Um, Here's a shot just north of the Twin Cities, outside the metro, but north of the Twin Cities, um, Cambridge zone, actually showing a lot of dead trees in the landscape. Circled here it's all oak wilt pocket, mainly oak wilt pocket. And I can almost guarantee that there's a lot of common buckthorn in that area. And again, the future, if left, just if no one touches that area, it's just going to be a brushy spot full of buckthorn and not dominated by oaks. Um, Oak wilt, it's not the only threat to our forests. In fact, I would argue that there are a few bigger threats to our oak forests. Believe it or not, lack of markets for low value wood is a big threat to our forests. Um, Traditionally, we manage forests by applying certain treatments to the trees, certain ways of cutting, certain ways of, and then certain ways of promoting younger trees, and we offset the costs of the management by selling the wood for any number of um, buyers for any number of reasons. Um, as time has gone on here, the markets for really low value wood have greatly decreased in the United States, and that is, believe it or not, a huge threat to our forests. Um, I know a lot of people think about like environmental sustainability. They want to help the environment, so a lot of people are choosing to buy locally grown food. And the same can go for locally grown forests. If we're able to use forests that are managed locally, that's better for the environment, in my opinion, than than otherwise. So that's a big threat to forest health throughout the United States. Um, Another huge threat to our forests is kind of lack of management, lack of burning. All of our forests, our oak dominated forests, mainly evolved over thousands and thousands of years to be burned. And once people of European descent started settling the land, started plowing it up, started farming, um, the quantity of burning in our forests drastically decreased, and that has caused all kinds of ecological problems with our forests now. That can be kind of replaced with certain management, but the bottom line is that our oaks, our small oaks, our mature oaks, to be healthy and to thrive, they need a lot of light. And if left untouched, um, if not managed, if not burned, if a windstorm doesn't come and blow down trees, the forests, an oak dominated forest, generally is going to evolve to be a maple dominated forest, or species that are more shade tolerant. And if there's invasive plants in the woods, those just take over. So a lack of disturbance is a threat. Invasive plants are a threat. Old age, believe it or not, is a threat. I think a lot of people think forests live forever. Well, they don't. All these trees have a limited lifespan. And believe it or not, our second oldest cover type in Minnesota is oaks. Only northern white cedar forests are older on average. If we were to take a look at forests that are 80 years old or older, the percentage of our oak forests that in that 80 or older bracket, it's second only to white cedar, which is quite unnatural as forest ecology goes. High deer populations are a big threat to forests. They love to mow down those baby oaks and then oak wilt. So those are the threats to our forests. But we can do a lot to prevent oak wilt. Bottom line, if you're able to avoid wounding an oak April through July, in particularly in that orange area where we for sure know there's a threat of oak wilt, you're going to be preventing a lot of oak wilt. Um, Likewise, if you own a woods, or let's say you want to cut down a tree here or there in your woods for whatever purpose, for firewood or maybe to make a shooting lane or something like that. And if your forest has oaks in it, even if you're cutting down a maple tree, if that maple tree is next to an oak, when you drop that tree, inevitably you're going to damage a little oak twig or oak limb in the process of felling the tree. So if you're able to not do that cutting in an oak dominated forest April through July, you're going to be avoiding a lot of oak wilt. Now, you can't avoid all wounds. Mother Nature wounds a lot of trees just through like wind damage. Sometimes your insurance company makes you cut like a dangerous limb that's hanging over your house or something. Sometimes you have to cut limbs in that risky period. That's okay. You just need to put paint on that wound. This is the only time, basically, that we recommend applying paint to fresh cuts. You want to do so immediately, and you can use basically a water-based paint. You can go to like a big box store and buy something called a tree wound dressing or pruning sealer. Those are fine. You could also use like shellac or just latex paint. You want to do that right away, and that actually forms a physical block to oak wilt. It's 100% effective if the paint dries and isn't like washed off by rain or something like that. Another thing, don't move fresh oak wood. Just leave it in place. Leave it on site like this property owner photographed here. They actually tarped up their diseased wood. You can go onto our website and you can find out more specifics on when to tarp, how to tarp. But most importantly, if you live in an area where there's oak wilt and you have a diseased oak, or you don't know what killed the tree, and you cut down the tree for firewood or lumber or whatever, just leave it in place at least for a year. If the bark is loose, it's safe to move. But if it's not loose, just don't move it. Leave it in place for a year before you move it to your cabin or hunting grounds or wherever. Keep it in place. Um, so if you get, let's say you get an arborist coming to your door in May, knocking on the door and saying, "Excuse me, it looks like your trees need pruning. We can prune up your trees and they'll be healthier." And then you ask, "Well, are you talking about my oak trees?" And they're like, "Yeah." If that happens, which does happen occasionally, you know that that arborist doesn't know what they should know to maximize tree health. Okay, I wouldn't recommend hiring somebody who recommends pruning your oaks in May or June. But there are a tremendous amount of arborists who know a tremendous amount of stuff about oak wilt, Dutch elm disease, emerald ash borer, things like that. They're a very important resource to help us take care of our ornamental trees. Now, they might say there's no risk to oak wilt, and let's say it's April 20th. They might be right. They might be using kind of more science-based way to assess whether there's oak wilt risk or not. So they could be using something like University of Wisconsin's ag um, website, where you can plug in your latitude and longitude and actually understand precisely if there's oak wilt that year or not. Because some years, like in 2012, the risk for oak wilt actually started throughout most of Minnesota in mid or late March. 2012 was a bizarre spring. Um, Most years it starts um, in the metro area in like mid or late April. Sometimes though, some years it doesn't start until early May. So professionals might use this website to more precisely understand if there is a risk of oak wilt. So here are the take-home points about oak wilt and oak forests. If you have oak wilt, please report it. If you're outside that hashed area, for sure, if you live in the white area and you have oak wilt, you got a lab confirmation, please let us know. Control is quite complicated and it needs to be done correctly. I've seen a lot of people try and control it on their own, just using their intuition, thinking, oh, I can just cut these trees down and that'll get rid of the problem. No, frequently that won't get rid of the problem. Sometimes you end up speeding up the spread of the underground spread of the disease more quickly than it would happen otherwise naturally. So you want to involve pretty much in all cases a professional who really knows how to control oak wilt. Basic things you can do to sustain oak forests. Well, don't wound oaks April through July. Don't prune them. Don't cut them. If oak wilt is a threat in your area, leave oak wood in place if it's coming from a diseased oak or sick oak. Just leave it in place. You can cut it down, in the wintertime generally, leave it in place. You could move it to a certain area on the property, but just leave it in place before you move it longer distances. Keep in mind, oak forests don't live forever. Oak forests and oaks, they evolved to be disturbed. If you don't, if no disturbance happens, your oak forest, no wind, no fire, no tree cutting, you're not going oak forests are going to cease to exist in that place in the long run. They're going to be replaced with like maple forests, um, brush. So they need disturbance. So what can you do? Plant oaks and plant a variety of oak species in canopy gaps. In fact, if a canopy gap was formed because of oak wilt, you can plant oaks there. By the time those seedlings or saplings will like connect to the diseased root system, it will be past that 5-year time frame where oak wilt can persist in the root system. So please plant a variety of oak species. Oaks are a fantastic species for Minnesota's future. The key is plant a diversity of species. Just don't plant one species, plant many and protect those seedlings. It takes a lot of work to plant trees. You better protect them from browsing deer. Deer love to nibble away on oak seedlings. You can protect them. Keep in mind, oaks need light. If you plant oaks in the shade, they're not going to be robust. They're not going to be healthy. Some will die. They need light at some point in their life to grow into the upper canopy. They need light. Control those invasive species. Control native shrubs too, though, around planted oaks or naturally growing oak seedlings or saplings. They need light. Call a professional. There are a lot of folks out there, private forestry consultants. A DNR forester can do a walkthrough in your woods with you to give you advice. You can contact a wildlife biologist. A lot of wildlife biologists know how to grow oaks because guess why? Remember, wildlife oaks are critical species for wildlife to do well in Minnesota. So that's all I have. I'm going to go over a series of resources for you. If you want to know more about oak wilt, go check out the Minnesota DNR's oak wilt webpage. And Cassie can drop a bunch of these links into the chat. We actually have a guide for really aimed at professionals or people who are very woods wise on our website that goes into even more depth than all of our web pages. If you want like an opinion, you can call a DNR stewardship forester to walk through your woods and give you advice. They can tell you how to promote oaks in your forest, how to sustain. If you want an oak forest to always be there, you're going to need to know how to do that. And we have a lot of great foresters out there that can help you. There are also people who some soil and water conservation districts in your county, they might have a forester on staff. They can help you with your woods too. There's a Minnesota Forestry Association comprised of a bunch of woodland owners. You can get advice there. Their website has a wealth of information to get you going. If you have an ornament, if you're just a homeowner with some ornamental oaks or any species, this is a fantastic website. I think it's the first stop that anyone should go to if you want to diagnose what's wrong with your tree. It's kind of a do-it-yourself website for diagnosing sick trees. It's fantastic. Um, and then if you need to hire a professional for ornamental tree care, you got to contact an arborist. There are many ways to find an arborist, but I'd say, the first spot you might want to check is the Minnesota Society of Arboriculture website. Beware those lookalikes. We've had 2021 was a severe drought throughout Minnesota. 2022 and 23 also had a lot of droughts. Those droughts were very, very stressful on our older forests. We have a lot of oak forests that are old, and they've really suffered because of those droughts. So it looks ugly out there in some of our oak woods because you got a lot of trees dying, really due to those droughts. So if you think you have oak wilt, look for those key indicators I mentioned and get a lab test. And that's all. I'll take questions if there's time. Hopefully there is.
Well, we got about
Ooh.
9 minutes for questions, Bud, and there's a lot of questions. So we're going to provide you with a list of questions and email addresses where you can go back, but we'll get through as many as we can. So do the amount of acorns produced by a tree indicate the type of winter we're going to have?
I would say no. This is not, I'm not like a tree physiologist, but my understanding with acorn production is it's almost random. Um, and I've never heard of it indicating whether a winter has been particularly stressful to trees or um, if the upcoming winter is particularly stressful. Keep in mind that like a winter like we're having right now, where for a lot of Minnesota there's very little snow. I don't know if we've experienced average temperatures. I'm guessing our winter temperature has been roughly average. Um, it doesn't stress the oak trees out whatsoever. Um, so yeah, it's the abundance of an acorn crop seems to be kind of random, and I don't think anyone can really predict it.
Okay.
The only prediction that's pretty safe is if there is a ridiculous quantity of acorns produced one year, chances are that the next year you aren't going to get so many acorns.
Okay, David wants to know, is there a beetle infestation that's also contributing to the oak tree loss in Minnesota?
Uh, yes, in a way. I mentioned two-line chestnut borer, and you could there are kind of outbreaks, very high populations of two-line chestnut borer. Two-line chestnut borer though is a native beetle, so it's throughout the whole state. The two-line chestnut borers aren't spreading; they're always there. Our native insects that are pests of trees, they're always throughout the state. It's just that certain environmental conditions help their populations grow or decline. Right now, two-line chestnut borer populations have been very high. We saw a slight decrease in the amount of damage they're causing in 2024 because we had so much rain in 2024 that helped the oak forests a little bit. Um, so I like to say that the reason that we're seeing a lot of oak losses throughout the state, it's really because of our recent climate, our recent droughts is really why. It's
Okay.
because it's not just the two-line chestnut borer populations that go up. It's also a root disease that goes up called armillary root disease. It's a bunch of stuff.
Okay. Kelly says, I have a large oak tree that is, the professional trimmer said may have a yeast infection. It has a dark staining coming down the trunk from one spot. Is this a thing, or should I be concerned that it's oak wilt? It's absolutely massive, and the tree is less than 5 feet from my house.
So um, yeasts do grow on trees. I mean, yeasts grow on kind of everything, and they're microbial single-celled fungi. Um, to say that an oak has a yeast infection is not accurate, but the arborist might have just been trying to use kind of plain language to describe to you the situation. All different types of problems can cause staining in wood. Um, what you know for sure, if you have staining in your wood, is that you have some sort of damage in your tree. some sort of infection, some sort of like a plain old wound that is not infected can actually cause staining of the wood. So it may or may not be serious.
Okay. Um, Emily says, are there oak trees in other continents that have developed an immunity to oak wilt fungus?
That's a really good question. So scientists have never found the origin of the oak wilt fungus. The same can be said for a lot of other tree pathogens. Um, we do know that the, like European white oak is extremely susceptible to oak wilt fungus. So we are quite sure that the oak wilt fungus does not come from Europe. I believe that I think it's the don't quote me on this, but an Asian chestnut species that grows in somewhere in Far East Asia also is highly susceptible to the oak wilt pathogen. So it's likely that the oak wilt pathogen didn't come from Far East Asia. Some scientists have figured that maybe the oak wilt fungus originated in Central America or South America.
Okay. Mary says, I planted 3 bur oaks 20 to 30 years ago on my boulevard, small town. The oaks have started leafing from the stems and shorter twigs. Is this oak wilt? Should I not be planting oaks again?
So those short twigs that you described they're called epicormic shoots. Epicormic shoots can grow out of trees for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it indicates that the tree is really stressed. And I suspect in your situation, the trees are growing because of stressful conditions. I mean, growing in a boulevard for any tree is a pretty stressful situation. They're more susceptible to drought stress. If some sort of pest or disease eats all the terminal buds on a tree, like at the outer edge of the canopy, that will also change the hormone mix within the tree that the tree produces, and you can get epicormics growing because of that damage too, which might not be too super stressful to the tree. So I'm guessing your tree is just stressed, and that's the reason for epicormics. It probably doesn't have oak wilt though. If bur oaks on your boulevard had oak wilt, they would continue to get worse pretty quickly year after year. It's confusing though on our white oak group because if you have an old white oak, like an old bur oak, and it's growing already in a stressful circumstance, um, symptoms of pretty severe decline from a variety of reasons can mimic oak wilt. So it's tough to diagnose that situation.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left, and we got a hard stop at 1 o'clock. Is the red oak more susceptible than white oak?
Yeah, you could say that red oaks are more susceptible to oak wilt than the white oak group. But that's not to say that oak wilt can't be really severe on bur oaks and white oaks. I've seen oak wilt kill off Quercus alba, which is our white oak, and I've seen oak wilt kill off bur oaks in like a few months, just like it can with oak wilt. There have been some white oaks. White oaks can recover from oak wilt. Our pure white oak, Quercus alba, I've seen that happen too.
Okay, so we have a ton of questions, Brian, and we'll forward those to you with their email addresses, and you can try and answer the ones you can. I want to thank you for coming on the show today. You're a wealth of knowledge on oak wilt and trees in Minnesota, so congrats on that. Next
Thanks,
week,
Craig.
tune in for episode 197, Fishers in Minnesota. And that should be a real interesting topic to discuss. And thank you everyone for signing in. Cassie, I'll have you take us back to the green room.